share screen option. Okay. Okay, so again, hello again, and thank you for connecting to this workshop. And we'll be talking about quantitative research today. And I'll try to condense a lot of information in 1 hour, but as much as you're able to take it. And then when you ask me to stop, I'll stop, because there is so much to cover in this. So let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen right now? Wait. Can you see my screen? Okay. So it's quantitative research. It's a very broad topic. And here you have my email address, and that's my website, nareshagrawal.com. And I also have another website called projectonenessworld.com. And if you're on Instagram, I have my paintings and photos over here on these two different handles. And if you're on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle here. And so you see, like, I try to find an image that represents quantitative over here. So I want to know from Yolanda, Abby, and Chris, between qualitative and quantitative, where do you see yourselves?
I would love to say that I was adept at qualitative, but my mind always veers towards quantitative. So I'm gonna play it safe and say mixed methods.
Okay, mixed
but
methods.
Like I always, in my brain, is always skewing towards quantitative.
Okay, and Yolanda?
Well, I'm so new at this. I'll say qualitative.
Qualitative. Okay, Abby?
Well, I have two research projects going right now, and one is each. And so I don't really have a strong like inclination either direction. One is interview data, and then one is like more of a statistical analysis. So
okay, no, and that's exactly how it should be, in the sense that your preference ideally should not guide what you do, because what should be guided by is what the research project demands. And whatever the project at hand requires, you should be able to pick a method or a way of approach, either qualitative or quantitative or a mixed methods, depending on what's the best strategy for that project. Okay. So I'll give a brief overview of my research area. At the heart of my research is the actor or the user, which is a person, as you can see, is a confused person over here. And Brenda Derwin likes to describe this person as a body, mind, heart, and spirit moving through time and space with a past history, a present reality, and future dreams or ambitions. And talking about Brenda Derwin, I do want to show you a little video of Brenda Derwin, because I interviewed her recently. And I do want you all to go back and try and watch this interview of hers, because she's such a wonderful person, and it's a very rare interview that she managed to give to me. It's more than 2 hours, but Brenda was saying that this would be a last interview. I hope not, but there is a lot to get from this interview, and this is a 1-minute trailer that I'm going to play right now.
I was an orphan, and then I was adopted by a then very wealthy family whose wife was the Wicked Witch of the East.
We still only see the PowerPoint.
Oh, you only see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I think you might not have shared your screen, just shared that window.
Stop share. I did share screen. Why is it allowing me like separate things?
You're also gonna, yeah, so you want to choose your it'll either let you show one window or show whatever you've got on your screen. And you're also going to want to click the button that says sound, like use computer
or share sound. Okay. Okay. Now do you, okay, am I sharing? I'm not sharing yet. Still giving me one at a time. Let's see. If I select multiple windows, share 5, okay, it says. And now if I select Chrome, now do you see it? Do you see the screen? Okay, I hope you see the sound now. Let's see.
I was an orphan, and then I was adopted by a then very wealthy family. His wife was the Wicked Witch of the East. She didn't love me. He couldn't love me because of her. And so I went through a door I could go through, which was my brain. So I came out of Michigan State a statistical whiz and the first female PhD and the first female president of ICA and the first female fellow of ICA. When we get to academia, you ask me for one word, I'll say misogyny. From beginning to end, you need to stay connected with your field and its demands, right, while doing what you think is right.
Your being not accepted for who you are made you more accepting of all kinds of people.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Because that's how I learned.
Okay, yeah, this was a 1-minute interview of a trailer of Brenda Derwin's interview. So what Brenda says in her sense-making methodology, that a person is a body, mind, heart, and spirit moving through time and space with a past history, a present reality, and a future dreams or ambitions. So basically, pretty much anybody like you or me, and it could be a knowledge worker, a medical resident, or library employee, an LIS student, or a doctoral student, or even a child or a preschooler. Okay. And welcome, Jay. You can keep your camera on if you want. And this person has a need for information, and when that need arises, the person goes looking for information. Not always, but a lot of times when you want to satisfy a curiosity that we might have, or there is a task that we need to complete, and you might start looking for information from one or more sources, from people and from books and from computer-based sources. And as that information comes about, so you can look for information from people or from books, or you can call it information search or retrieval from technology-based sources. And sometimes we find information serendipitously when we're not really looking for it. And we have this big aha moment when that happens. And we try to make sense of this information, and some of it makes sense. It answers some of our questions, and if not, we have more questions that might arise, so the cycle sort of continues. Right? And there are also times when you avoid information. So for the past few years, I've been doing research on information avoidance, or why do people ignore certain calls and messages on a daily basis, and how do people whose calls are missed or not responded to, how do they react, and what is the point of view of the receiver or the sender of those messages. So this entire phenomena can be thought of as information behavior. And a related area that I work on is called knowledge management, where you look at the similar phenomena but from an organization's point of view. Okay. And this need for information comes about in a certain context, and that context is often thought of as either a workplace where the person works, or the certain circumstance or a certain situation that a person is in. But as such, there's quite a bit more to that. So in 2018, I wrote this book called Exploring Context and Information Behavior, which tries to come up with a definition of what context is. And then last year, I wrote this book, which came out with 2 different versions on the stories of 25 people who went on to find the ikigai, or reason for being in life. And it also has instances of case studies of serendipity in that. So this instance of serendipity is a part of that book. And I also wanted to show you my website a little bit. So here you have my website, and there's a page here called the research page. And this page is useful because there's one tab on research interests and one on publications and some on ordinary projects. And this is from Google Scholar, the current citations and so on. But I've organized this based on different areas on information behavior, knowledge management, and learning methods and happiness. And there are sub areas over here So in most of these, I've tried to, under these areas, right, whichever area you click on, let's say you go to context, information, behavior, I've described what kind of paper it is, a short paper, book, or a panel, or a journal article, and then it's a citation, and then there's a link to the journal page, or if it's something that can be shared, then there is a download link for either the full text for the publisher version or the author version, whichever is allowed to be shared as per the copyright signed for those publishers. Okay. So this is the research page. Now, when we think of research, one question for you at this point is, what is research? You all are PhD students and you've been doing research, right, in some form or the other. So what is research? This is the time for you to speak, and I'm going to write what you say.
A systematic exploration of concepts and knowledge about that.
Okay. Chris?
I feel like research has to be like new knowledge. You have to come up with something new.
Okay. Okay.
I would say research is also processing past knowledge.
Okay.
And making it relevant.
Okay. Jay?
I think people use scientific methods to do research.
What methods?
Scientific methods.
Okay. Okay, people use. Okay. Scientific methods to do what?
To study something that interests people's mind.
To study something that interests, because we can't call it research, that's what we're trying to define. That interests people's minds, okay? So there is, we saw a few things. So one is concepts and knowledge, that was one part. And then we said something that interests people's minds. So those are the two things as what is being studied. And then also past knowledge. Let's say you use past knowledge and you use that to study something that interests your mind and some concepts of knowledge. And hopefully it has to be relevant in some ways. And then you use some kind of a systematic exploration or a scientific method to come up with something new. So I think we have a definition, right, based on all the things that you said. So let's look at a definition which is there in past research. So here, this was a paper that I had done with one of our master's students and our librarian Linda Watkins a few years ago. And let's see if I can zoom in. So this was a paper looking at all the LIS journals at Simmons University. It was Simmons College then, and trying to see that how much of the LIS literature that the library subscribed to qualifies as research. And Linda Watkins used to have a theory that it was only 4%, but she always talked about doing some research. So before she retired, I wanted to have this research so that she could retire with the paper in hand. And we later discovered that it was 16% as per this research. And but this has a definition of what is research. Let's see if I can get to. Wait. Okay, zoom in. Okay, so here it says, research is any inquiry that is carried out at least to some degree. So an inquiry, right? So one is studying something, that's the inquiry word is here. that is carried out at least to some degree by a systematic method, okay, and with the purpose of eliciting some new facts, concepts, ideas. So I think all of you, what you said pretty much is in this very well-known definition, which has been cited, like, I don't know, thousands of times by, it's a definition from 1980 on what is research. Okay. So when we think of research, then, so here, okay, let me make it single page continuous. Yeah. So then the next question then is, once we have research, right, and we carry out research using a scientific method, what are the different kinds of methods that we can use to carry out research or to carry out some inquiry about a phenomena? Some examples of research methods that you could give?
Interviews, surveys.
Okay, let me write this down. Okay. So interviews, surveys. Okay.
Participatory research, like action research,
Okay.
observation, experiments.
Okay.
Data mining,
Okay.
literature review.
Okay. Do things like meta-analysis or something. We also do bibliometrics. We do content analysis.
Mixed methods.
Do mixed methods. Now, based on these, you could also do like conceptual studies, conceptual or theoretical studies. Okay. Which of these is qualitative? Which of these is quantitative?
Surveys for sure.
Okay. Surveys. What else?
Data mining and content analysis can be.
So can be.
Bibliometrics.
Okay. Can be. Okay. What else?
Bibliometrics.
Yeah, bibliometrics, right? So yeah, interviews has focus groups, then ethnographic studies, then you have a case study, things like that. What else is
Sometimes experiments could be quantitative as well.
so experiments are usually quantitative, right, in a lot of ways. I think the experiment is typically considered a quantitative research method. So surveys, experiments. Okay. So here, this paper shows different types of research methods that were identified in those studies: content analysis, interviews, focus groups, questionnaire, survey, observation, usability, experiment research, bibliometrics, action research, case study, and classroom research. Now here, if you look at the definition of a survey, right? So researchers ask questions in a fixed order with predetermined responses as choices. So that's one thing as a survey that we all know. Experimental research is testing or trying for the sake of discovery of proof. So usually you divide participants into multiple groups, one or more groups, and one group is an experimental group, one group is a control group. So one group gets some intervention, the other group doesn't get, and you want to see if there's an effect of the intervention on that group or not. And then you can do bibliometrics, where you're trying to look at trends of data from data and all. Okay, so we will focus a lot more on the survey method today, right now. But I have slides on experiments too if we have time. Um, so then looking at what is quantitative research. So let's look at one paper here. Which is a paper on the fundamentals of quantitative research. Okay. So here this paper talks about, again, types of research based on applications as pure research or applied research, and as objective of the research being either descriptive or exploratory. Exploratory is like when something is new and has not been studied yet or studied in detail. For instance, if you want to study the effect of how students in colleges are coping to going back to school in the Omicron era or something, or removal of mask in the time of the Omicron. So that's something very new, right? So whatever you study in that phase would be something exploratory, and so you can also have like explanatory research and correlational research. But the type of information that you're looking for, that could be either be qualitative or quantitative, or it could be both as a mixed as well. And so here, quantitative research has basically numbers, where there's numerical representation and manipulation of observations for the purpose of describing and explaining the phenomena that those observations reflect. And it employs empirical methods and empirical statements. So when we say what is empirical, right, it means what is the case in the real world rather than what ought to be. So this is one of the primary problems in life. A lot of the times we get anxious in life is also because we expect things to be in a certain way, what ought to be. Like the world should be free of COVID, for instance, right? But it is not. And so when we are able to accept things for what they are rather than what we think they should be, we have a much happier life. And even the idea of stress is supposed to be the difference between what is and what we think should be. So when we think of empirical research or what is empirical, right, we are trying to study what is. And so it's supposed to be objective, even though there's a researcher's bias, but it's supposed to be as objective as possible. And we try to have statements which are expressed in numerical terms. So it's a type of research that is explaining phenomena by collecting numerical data that are analyzed using mathematically based methods, in particular statistics. Okay. So here there are different types of quantitative research. So examples are survey research, correlational research, experimental research, and causal comparative research. So again, different types, but one very widely used research is a survey method. Why is the survey method useful? It's because it is possible to reach out to a large number of people in a short amount of time, as compared to, let's say, case studies or interviews where you generate a huge amount of data from a few people. So qualitative research is better to go when you want to go into the how and why of things, when you want to go deeper. But when you want to answer the what question, not so much of the how and why, and you want to get a large sample covered in a short amount of time, then the survey research works really well. Experimental research is useful when you want to manipulate something in a controlled setting, when you want to say that you give people a certain intervention and the other people are not given that, then you could do an experiment in that setting. So the downside of an experiment is that it is often done in a controlled setting, so it may not represent a real world phenomena, but it is important because you can manipulate whatever you're trying to study really well. So for an instance, let's say you have a classroom, right, and you want to find out people's comfort with in a classroom setting in this time right now. So you ask half the people to wear masks and come to the class, and you ask half the students to come without wearing masks, and then you find out about the level of comfort in the learning environment or the satisfaction at the end of it. Okay? So it's a very controlled thing, but then you're requiring people to behave in a certain manner. but it may not represent their preference in the real life. In a survey research, you don't really mandate any such thing. You just study based on whatever their preference is, whatever they end up choosing on their own. Okay, so survey is much more reflective of a real life. Experiment is more controlled in that sense. But in an experiment, you can get much more nuanced findings based on what like the specific intervention, and you don't have. So the researcher has more power to control. So then there are basic assumptions in quantitative and qualitative research. In the quantitative research, the assumption is that reality is objective and singular, and it is different, and it is different and apart from the researcher. Whereas in qualitative research, you assume that the reality is subjective and multiple, as seen by the participants in a study. Okay? And in quantitative, you assume that the research is independent from that that is being researched. And in qualitative, the researcher often interacts with what is being researched. So when you go and interview someone, you as an interviewer also influences the people. So that influence also happens when you carry out a survey, but the idea is that the potential for bias is slightly less as compared to in qualitative studies. But even though we have to be careful about the bias, especially in survey studies. And so quantitative ideally is supposed to be value-based and unbiased. In qualitative, you accept that there are values and there's a bias involved. So in quantitative, there's a formal it's formal, is based on set definitions, impersonal voice, and use of accepted quantitative words. And qualitative is informal, it's evolving decisions, personal voice. Okay. So again, here it is supposed to be deductive, there's cause and effect, and there's some generalization leading to prediction or explanation. And it's supposed to be more accurate through tests such as reliability, validity, and also on. Okay. So these were some of the assumptions in quantitative research. So let me take you through some sections of my book, going through the process of designing a quantitative research study, especially a survey study when you want to go about in a phenomenon. Okay. So let me open the book here. Okay, so let me just, there's a lot of scrolling. Just a sec. So the book has a few sections. One is the part of why context matters. The second part is on literature review. And then there is mapping the conceptual space of context. And then there's a discussion. And there's one part which is of importance to you, and especially for this workshop today. And that is of designing research studies incorporating context. So this is where the study design comes in. It's on page 109. But before that, we will look at another page here. Okay. And there is this page here which talks about stereotyping. So when you want to study a group of people, let's say you want to study the information behavior of say scientists or of students or researchers or social workers and so on, you are basically putting them in a circle. You're putting them in a circle of LIS students or social workers or scientists or whatever category you call them, and we are trying to do some level of stereotyping. So we are trying to study their context or his context or her context in some case. So there's a stereotyping going on, and even if you study the context of one person in a certain environment, that is again a level of stereotyping that's going on. Okay? And sometimes when you go do ethnographic research, when you go and position yourself into the context or the surroundings of a person and study that person for an extended period of time, there you can say that you do less of stereotyping and you become a part of the research as well. And this is more qualitative, this way of doing it. So here what I say is that the three outer circles in figure 3.5 represent the different methods of studying people or groups by researchers, depending on how much of the actor's personal view of context they consider in the way of gathering data. With phenomenological or ethnographic on the left-hand side and the more positivist view. Here the context is seen as everything that surrounds the researcher, surrounds the participants in the study. Okay. So the outer circle is more solid. So this is having a barrier between the researcher and the participant. And the idea is to minimize bias. Okay? But at the same time, this is the word stereotyping is important because whatever you study, right, is an assumption of what you're studying. It's like when you say there are 10 colors or 20 colors, right? When you teach a child how many colors are there, and a child says red, green, blue, yellow, and all of those colors, those are not the only colors that are there in the universe, right? We have hundreds of thousands of colors. But we try to simplify reality in order to understand. And the same way that we do with classification and categorization that we study in LIS when we try to organize information in a certain way. So it is a simplistic view, it is not reality. So a lot of the quantitative research, in a way, or a positivist research, is a simplification of reality. It is not reality as such. Okay? So then the second part that I want to come to in this is when you want to design a questionnaire survey. So how can you go about it? Okay? So initially, even before you think of a method, you need to have a research question. And as a PhD student, you know that how hard it is to come up with a research question, right? And ideally, you can spend up to a year to come up with a question, or sometimes more than that. And it's very important that you spend that much time in coming up with a question, because whatever question you come up with, you stay with it for at least 20 years. Because you carry out a literature review, and the more you study, the more you get to know, and you keep getting better and better at the phenomena. And then it takes 3 or 4 years or 5 years by the time you finish your PhD and you write all of that down. And for the next few years, you're publishing that, whatever you have studied. And then any studies that you tend to do, you tend to follow up on those, because you're supposed to have a narrow research agenda, which kind of builds upon your previous studies. So even though you go into some directions or some trajectories here and there, by and large, you'll find that if you continue to do research, whatever questions you started with your PhD during your PhD years, those questions stay with you. Like for instance, context was a word that I learned when I was doing my PhD, and I wrote a paper on that during that time, and then in 20 years later, I ended up writing a book on it. So it's a kind of a thing that those things stay with you for an extended period. So your research question is the most important. Then based on the research question, you try to come up with a hypothesis. Like there are two things. If it's exploratory research, or sometimes if it's like grounded theory, you're letting some data drive your thinking, then you don't really need a hypothesis in qualitative research. But in quantitative research, you need to have a hypothesis. So can you tell me what's a hypothesis? Maybe we'll write here.
I'm sorry, do you want a definition or an example?
Anything is fine. I just want your thoughts.
A proposed or possible truth that is to be tested.
Okay. Truth, that is. And any examples?
I have posed the hypothesis before a study last year that library fines had an inverse direct relationship with library usage.
Library fines, okay.
Fines, yeah.
Have an inverse relationship with library usage. Okay. So it means that the more you fine, the less it's used, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a good example, okay, of a hypothesis. We'll call it. So one thing you have to be very careful in coming up with hypothesis is that whatever you do, right, must be measurable. So library usage is something that is measurable. That you can come up with some kind of some items or some ways to measure library usage. And for library fine, it's not the fine themselves. So you'll have some kind of imposition of library fines or something, right? And that is what you're trying to measure as such. So this imposing, now this is one variable that you have, and this is another variable. Okay. So which means here you have a cause and you have an effect. Okay. So your cause is imposition of library fines, and you have an effect called library usage. So this is called your independent variable. Okay. So I'll call it IV here, and this is a dependent variable. And what we just came up with like this is a research model. It's an empirical research model. And here what we call this is a hypothesis. This is a hypothesis 1. So it's a very simple model with two variables, with one variable leading to the other, and with a hypothesis denoted by the arrow over here. Okay. Are you all right with staying for another 20-30 minutes more, because I want to cover some things if you all are not? Okay. Okay. So then here you have these two variables, one variable leading to the other, and you could have multiple variables. Okay. So the most difficult part is coming up with this research model, which can take at least a month or two initially when you're trying to plan your research study, because you do not you have to ensure that whatever you're trying to study is something of interest, because remember what you all said is potentially of value initially when we talked about what is research, right? Whether this is of interest, whether it is of value or not, or does it answer the so what question. Okay. So when you have this, so in this case, this is an important variable, library usage, and often this becomes the title of a research paper or a title of dissertation, whatever you're trying to study, this last part. And these are the other factors that affect that. Okay, so independent variables, and you could have something in between as well. So you could say imposition of library fines leads to dissatisfaction or anxiety, let's say, right? And which leads to which affects library usage. So now we could have two hypotheses if we did that. So in which case this anxiety here becomes a type of variable called a mediating variable or a mediator. So your imposing library fines leads to anxiety, which in turn leads to a negative usage of the library. Does it make sense until now? Okay. And we have another kind of variable which is called a moderator. Okay. Can anyone tell me what is a moderator or a moderating variable?
Could that be like the something that's going to strengthen or weaken the relationship between the cause and
Yeah.
effect?
Yeah, so something that strengthens or weakens. So it will specify the conditions under which the conditions under which the relationships is affected. So let's say imposition of
So it could be like the amount of the fines, like higher fines, lower fines.
Yeah, it could be amount, or it could be let me put this let me get to this page again. Yeah, new slide. So let's say that we have this part here, which is imposition of library fines. Okay. What I'm telling you right now is these are very, very important things, because once you get these parts clearly right, everything builds upon these, and you have a very clear understanding, because understanding of research model is so important that you will be able to understand all kinds of research studies and design them really well. So this is an independent variable and a dependent variable. And then let's say we say money is important or something. Importance of money. Let's say, for instance, importance of money, importance of money in society, for instance, or the amount of the fine or something, or if money matters, let's say. So this hypothesis will hold, okay, only if money matters. All right. If money doesn't matter to society, then this hypothesis doesn't hold. So then you're supposed to have an arrow from here. So draw, let's say I'm going to draw like this. Okay. So this is called a moderator, which affects not a variable directly, but affects the relationship between two variables. Okay. And the moderators are interesting because they often make for the most interesting research studies. Rather than just having a direct cause and an effect, when you put a moderator, you're putting a nuance to it. You're putting some conditions under which a hypothesis holds. Okay, so most interesting research studies are the ones with moderators, and it also calls for some extra level of analysis when you're doing data analysis of this. Okay? So this is called a moderator. We saw a mediator over here. This was a mediator where anxiety was a mediator. So that's all. So we have independent variables, dependent variables, mediators, and moderators. Are we clear on that? Okay. So now let me show you an example of a study. Okay. So yeah, I have a lot for you, but it just depends on how much. That's why I was thinking, like, this whole thing was so interesting, but there's so much, so I didn't know how much to give you and in what form. So this was a study that I did when I was doing my PhD in Singapore. And this was a class assignment because I did a course on quantitative analysis. And as part of the course, when I was a PhD student, my classmate who was Wang Zin and Wang, so two of us, we were a team, and we collected some data. We had to carry out a survey, and as part of the class, we had to do data analysis, quantitative data analysis. Okay, and this paper came out of that, and now I think it has lots of citations. If you look for factors affecting 3G adoption. Okay. So it has 63 citations. So don't underestimate the work that you do as classwork during your PhD work. If you publish it, you could get like a good number of citations from it. Okay. So in this study then, I'm going to zoom in again. So here, what I just showed you as example. So this was looking at the factors that affect the adoption of 3G mobile phones in Singapore. Now we have 5G right now, but that time 3G was a big deal. Okay. So we came up with a research model here. So in a similar way. Okay. So there, earlier we saw the example with 2 or 3 variables, and this one has 6 variables. Now I think, so now you all are an expert in which one is the dependent variable here in this model?
We only see your PowerPoint.
Oops, you don't see that? How do I stop share this? Okay, how do I select everything? It's asking me to, like, it's asking me.
The top leftmost option is usually your screen. So it's whatever you have open on your screen.
It just says whiteboard right now, the top left option.
Oh,
the screen option is not there. Okay, I think I shared everything now. So let's see. Okay, so this was the paper that we published. Now we can see it.
Yes, now we see it.
Okay. So factors. So I showed you other things in the past. I think you may not have seen some of the other PDFs I showed you. So you may have missed that. Okay. So factors affecting 3G adoption and empirical study. Okay. So here, this was the paper. So we're looking at what factors affect the adoption of 3G mobile phones in Singapore. And this was the research model now. Okay, so here you have earlier we saw the examples with 2 variables or 3 variables. Now this has 6 variables in it. Okay, now can you tell me which is the dependent variable in this, like the effect in this cause-effect relationship?
Purchase intention.
Purchase intention, right? So that is the dependent variable here. Okay, and then which one is the independent variable or variables? So I'll go take you back to this just for example. This is what we impositional library finds. This is an independent variable, right? So now we're looking for the same independent variables in this study here.
The service model, the mobile phone service.
The variety of service, you mean this one? No, the variables all written here in the box. We just have to tell me which box is independent variable. So Chris said the 4 on the left. Okay, that's wrong. The answer is wrong. It is close, but it's not fully correct.
Well, I guess, I mean, convenience is, I guess, dependent on variety of service in this model and not its own.
Not its own. So one simple way to identify is whenever you have an arrow going in and not coming out, that's a dependent variable. That's one thing, okay? And when we have only arrows coming out but not going in, that is an independent variable. So you have variety of service has an arrows coming out of it but not going in. That's independent, okay? And service quality has an arrow coming out but not going in, so that's independent. Price has an arrow coming out but not going in. Okay, so you have these 3 independent variables: variety of service, service quality, and price. And this purchase intention is dependent because it only has an arrow coming in. And then you have another variable where you have an arrow coming in and going out. Okay, so that is where you have convenience, because that's a mediating variable. It's a mediator, arrow coming in and going out. And perceived value again has arrows coming in and going out, so that's a mediator as well. So what I'm trying to say in this is that in a mobile phone, right, whether you want to have a 3G phone or not, or a smartphone, it depends on the variety of service. So the more the service is provided by the phone, the more convenient it is, and the greater the quality of service. All of that will lead to a perceived value, which will lead to an intention to buy the phone, a purchase intention. But if the price is high, that will have a negative impact on the value. So these have a positive relationship and this is a negative relationship. And the more the variety of services are there, the more it will lead to convenience. And the more convenient a person finds a phone, that person is likely to see more value in it, and that's is likely to find an intention to buy. Now, when you're designing a study, right, how do you know what to include, whether to include convenience or whether to include service quality and all this? How do you decide what to include, what to exclude?
Well, I guess you should build on the literature. So look at what's already been included or not included, or how it's been defined, and if it makes sense to include in your
study,
in
right?
your investigation. Yeah.
So then what you do is that typically purchase intention is your or adoption of 3G phones is your main intention in the study. So what you do is that you first do a literature review, because you do not know, right? As a new PhD student, you do not know what's out there. So you spend a long time first finding out. Once you have to find out what you're interested in. So once you know what you're interested in, that's your research question, or you have some idea for research question. But then you want to know what other people have done in that area. So you do a lot of literature search, whatever you can find. So there are 2 kinds of literature searches you need to do. So one is called a general literature review. And in that general literature review, you'll do things about like you will find out about, okay, mobile phones and mobile phone usage and all of that. Typically, that's the kind of literature reviews that I find a SLIS students doing, right? Whenever any phenomena is there, you try to do a review, whatever you can find on that topic, divided in different themes. So once that is there, you kind of have an idea about, you need to have what theory that you're going to use to guide your search. Okay, so for this study, I used a theory called the technology acceptance model, or a TAM model. Okay, technology acceptance model. So you need to be familiar with various theories. So if you look at IS theories or something, this is a project which lists various theories that have been studied in communication and other fields and all that. Okay? So we have to be familiar with a large number of theories, and in here, technology acceptance model is one of the theories over here. Okay? So according to this model, you have a very simple thing that these people, Davis et al. In 1989, they said that whenever you find something easy to use, you're likely to find it useful as well. And both your usefulness and ease of use will affect the intention of using that, and that will affect the actual system use. So this is a very simple theory. It's been used by a lot of people, but this is good and easy in it has a causal relationship. A causal means that, okay, one thing is causing the other. So whenever you're trying to do a statistical test or a quantitative study, you need to be able to show a causal relationship between phenomena. If you do not show a causal relationship, if you, let's say, don't have arrows going in and all, then it can be a framework to guide you, but it cannot really be a causal. So for instance, I'll show you an example. Let's say so I have a paper on serendipity in information research, coming up with the definition of serendipity in information behavior. So this is not a causal model. It's a framework. Even though we call it models, but it's not, you don't see one variable leading to the other. There's no arrow to it. Okay? So even you have all these circles, but you don't have clear arrows from one thing going to the other. And this one again doesn't have. So these can all be termed as frameworks really, but they're not causal models. So this one has arrows, but they're going on both the directions. So this kind of arrow, where you have a clear arrow going from one thing to the other, these are useful in designing quantitative studies. Okay, so this is called a research model. So in this case, using this example of, I use this model or as an example, and use that to design my study here, over here. So where I took the ease of use, and instead of ease of use, I called it convenience in this case. And the usefulness, I call it as a value. And that behavioral intention or purchase intention, that was over here. But I found that there were other things in the case of 3G phones which could affect this value. And that was the quality and variety of service and all of that. So that would have a positive impact. Okay. So thank you, Yolanda. Okay. And then price would have a negative impact on it. Okay. So based on these, we designed the study. And what you need to do is that you need to do literature search now. After having done a general literature search, you need to do a literature search on each of these terms or keywords. So you need to do a search on purchase intention. What have other people searched on and found on purchase intention? What have other people searched and found perceived value? What have people found in variety of service, convenience, or service quality or price? And then, so you need to have a paragraph on each then in your literature search. Okay. So on convenience, what you could find. So 3G has brought workforce, something so and so found. How some person defined convenience. Okay. As how certain activities are made easier. What all does it include? Okay. And then you can write whatever you can find in this. And you also need to come up with your own definition of which definition from these do you adopt in your study. As how do you define convenience? That's very important, because when you're designing research studies, you have to be very clear about how do you understand to explain this term. Okay? And same thing for service quality as well. So you try to define service quality in this. You define what is computer self-efficacy, what is variety of service, and value. Okay. And again on price. So once you have come up with a literature review on each of these topics, so do you see that why it is important not to have too many boxes in your model? Because the more boxes you include, the more literature search you need to do on each one, and the more things you need to study. So ideally, you should have just a few boxes. So I would recommend, typically in my classes, I would say like 2 or 3 boxes, or 4 boxes at the most. Like 2 or 3 are good enough, right? Because the more you have, the more work you need to do. And then, and each of these arrows is a hypothesis. So once you have these boxes, once you have done a literature search, then you need to say, you need to explain why do you think variety of service leads to convenience. And for that, you need to come up with both theoretical arguments, something based on the literature, and also something based on your arguments. You need to both use both literature and use your own arguments to come up with that. And sometimes it's also better to use some theory if you can find a theory to explain that. If you can find some theory to explain, and all these are important because when you go for your PhD defense, right, people will look for that. They'll say that what is the theoretical base, and if you say that this thing leads to that, they'll say that do you have some theory to explain why do you think convenience or a variety of service would lead to perceived value. So in my case, I had the technology acceptance model as a base, so which explained the overall model, but you could also have things explaining individual arrows. Okay, so once you explain all of that, you come up with a hypothesis. So you argue why that would be the case, and then you say, therefore, we hypothesize that the variety of service provided by 3G positively affects the convenience in using 3G. So you need to come up with an argument for each one of these hypotheses. Okay. So you're with me until now? Until here is fine? Any questions or any doubts as to why you do that? Okay. So once you do this, okay, the next step is that you had a certain definitions in your literature as to how certain people defined variety of service, how they define convenience. So you also go and look at those papers to see if they have any surveys or any ways in which they try to measure those, if they try to measure convenience. Okay? Because when you're coming up with a survey questions, you should come up with questions which are there in the literature beforehand, before you. Okay? And not try to come up with these on your own, because they don't have validity if you try to come up with these questions on your own, because they have not been tested. So then what you do is that you come up with a table like this, where you call this a construct. A construct is a phenomena that you're trying to study. Each of these are constructs. Okay, so your variety of service, convenience, price, service quality, value, behavioral intention, all of these are constructs. Okay, and then for each of these constructs, ideally you should try to come up with 3 to 5 items, or 3 to 5 ways of measuring the constructs, because one is a construct and one is a way of measuring the construct. And let me give an example. Let's say we have happiness that you're trying to study. Okay, how do I go back to home? Okay, yeah. And you want to measure happiness. Now, how will you measure happiness in a survey? Let's say you want to come up with the questions on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is strongly agree, it's Likert scale, and 1 is strongly disagree. So tell me 5 questions that I can ask in a survey to measure happiness. You see how hard this is?
I don't even know where to start.
I
And this is
feel
something-
positive about life more days than not.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I feel grateful most of the time. Something, right? I am at peace with myself, right? I am at peace with the world, right? I feel a deep connection with nature, something like that. And any so you can see you can come up with lots of questions depending on how you're trying to describe it in your literature and how you're trying to operationalize it. So whatever definition you come up with for happiness, it can be based on short term, it can be based on pleasure, it can be based on well-being, whichever way we define it, then we come up with these measures. So now you see why it is so important to base our questions on prior literature, because somebody else has come up with these questions and tested it with a group of people and collected data based on that. So when we go on, let's say if we go to Bhutan, gross national happiness, okay, questionnaire. So the government of Bhutan has come up with something called a gross national happiness index, okay, and they have defined happiness in terms of these 9 criteria. Now Abby was saying correctly that you don't know where to start, right? And it was so they kind of dealt with this question for a number of months or years, and they came up with these 9 kind of sub-dimensions of happiness: psychological well-being, health, education, use of time, cultural diversity, good governance, community, ecology, living standards. And then for each of these, they had I think this website is not working right now, but then they come up with a whole series of questions on these, okay, multidimensional. So that is why when you go to our study here, you should try and use the questions which other people have come up with as far as possible, okay. And sometimes when you have your own variable that you're coming up with, where you can't find the questions, that is where you come up with your own question. So I said for a variety of service, compared to non-3G phones, the variety of services offered by 3G is significantly larger. Strongly disagree or agree. So this one we call it self-developed. It will save me the effort of meeting when I can see my friends on the 3G phone. Okay. So this is how you come up with lots of questions, and why you are supposed to come up with at least 3 and ideally 4 to 5 questions for each, sometimes even 6 if you can, is because when you are doing a data analysis, some of these questions will get dropped because they will not fulfill one criteria called there's something called convergent validity and discriminant validity. Convergent and discriminant validity. Okay. So these terms are important. Now, there's this one construct called self-esteem. Okay. Convergent and discriminant validity. So there is one construct called self-esteem, and there's another construct called locus of control. And let's say you came up with these 3 questions on self-esteem for this survey, and for your locus of control you came up with these other 3 questions. Interestingly, what is supposed to happen is that all the questions for self-esteem should be very similar to each other in terms of when it comes in a data, right? They should all converge together, which means that they should all be very close to each other, very similar to each other, but very different from the questions belonging to the other construct. So let's say that you have a question called happiness, one of the things you're trying to study, and let's say it's also trying to study satisfaction. So if you're studying happiness and satisfaction, or let's say you're trying to study contentment, it might be that the questions that belong to happiness and the questions that belong to contentment are similar. Don't you think so in some ways? And if that happens, it will not satisfy this criteria of these questions being different from each other. The whatever questions you come up with this in a survey, all the questions that belong to all the items in a question that belong to one construct, they must all belong to only that construct, but not to another construct. Understand this, because this is a very, very important thing in quantitative data analysis or quantitative data study design. So as far as the statistical software, let's say SPSS or any software is concerned, that software has no idea what questions you're trying to study. It doesn't even care. Okay, so that software, when you go to that software, you put all these. Let's say you have all the survey questions. You collect data from 100 people, and you have all the responses from 100 people. You put all those responses together. You feed those responses in the software in SPSS. Okay, and then what will happen is, based on the responses you got on a scale of strongly agreed to, on a scale of 1 to 5, let's say 3 or 4, 1, some average scores are there. You put all of that in SPSS, and then whatever data you get at the end of it, right? You try to see what pattern does it emerge. So whichever questions belong together, you make different sets of data. So in this case, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7. There are 7 constructs that we have, constructs of variables. Now you might question that we have 7 here, but we had only 6 in the model. How come we have 1 more over here? Can anyone tell me why that's the case? Our model only had 6. Our research model. You remember that time? Our model only had 6. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 boxes, right? But we have 7. We also had IT self-efficacy in here. So is it possible for you to have more things than there are in your model?
Did that like emerge from the data?
So those are known as some control variables. So control variables are variables which are not of interest in a study. They are not independent variables, dependent variables, or mediating or moderators. But those are things which you don't think that have an impact, or you don't think that's of interest in your study. But just in case it does end up having an effect, so you still gather the data for it in the questionnaire. Okay? So you can have things like gender, you can have things like education level, stuff like that. So things that you think that might have an interest. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jay. Yes, you can watch the recording later, Jay. Yeah. So there, what happens is that based on this, so in this case, we also have IT self-efficacy as one of the variables, which we don't think would be of interest, but we are still gathering the data. Okay. So then there are these 7 items. So you collected the data from 100 people or 200-300 people, whatever number of people, and then you threw that all the data in SPSS, and then you want to see what patterns emerge. Okay, so you want to see a grouping of data based on these 7 categories, because you have 7 groups of things, right? And groups of questions. But let's say instead of 7, you only got 5 categories. Then what's the problem? Do you understand why it is important to have 7 categories from your data? Because you are trying to study 7 things. If you're trying to study 7 things, you are supposed to get 7 different responses for those 7 things from your data. But let's say when you put them in SPSS, and you see that, and you don't tell the SPSS that what SPSS doesn't even know like what these terms mean, because that's just a software, right? It's just looking at the responses. And based on those responses, it has to put them in those 7 different categories. But then it finds that you only have things in 5 categories. What that means is that 2 variables are correlated with each other. So let's say we have happiness and satisfaction. They're too similar to each other. And ideally, you have to avoid variables which are correlated. So anything that is too much like each other, you don't want to include those. You only want to study those things that are sufficiently different from each other when you're designing a research model, because that's a very, very important part, because that your study could fail because of that. Okay? So that is one. And other things you find is that maybe the variables, you still get 7 items, but then some individual items are kind of similar to the items from some other items. So if you find that one particular survey item is like another item, then you drop that one. So these the ones with stars are the ones which came out problematic after the study. and we have to drop them. Okay, and that is why you come up with 3 or 4 or 5 to begin with, so that in a data analysis stage, if you need to drop some, you can drop them. So EFA is called exploratory factor analysis, CFA is called confirmatory factor analysis, and some items can be dropped after the exploratory analysis which you do on your pilot data. So pilot data is usually 30-40 people or 50 people that you gather data from, and then you do that, and then you for the CFA you drop them after you gather everything. Okay, so based on these, you can drop all these. You come up with a final questionnaire, and then so literature, until here we saw this. Okay, until the literature review part is fine. So when you are designing a survey instrument, you should try to get your survey questions from prior studies as far as possible. Okay, and in your pilot test, you usually you use at least 30 people or so to you need some sample. You can't have like a pilot test with like 5 or 10 people. You need at least a sufficient number of sample. But then let's say you collect data from 30 people, and then you realize that you made major mistakes in the way you're designing a survey. Okay, and some questions were wrong, or some of the variables were too close to each other and all that. Then you end up wasting all the data. Like those people are gone, and if you're paying them $15, $20 per person to fill out the survey, you also wasted a lot of money, right? So it is very expensive. So you have to design that part well. So then what I did is that I came up with a paper called I have this in the slide here. Okay. I came up with this paper called Verifying Survey Items for Construct Validity, a 2-stage sorting procedure for questionnaire design in information behavior research. Okay, so this paper again has been cited quite a bit, I think. It's cited by 97 people. Okay, so what this paper does is that it avoids that expensive process that we just talked about, this construct validity paper. Okay. So what it does is, rather than needing 30 people or 50 people to do that analysis, you can do it with 4 people or 8 people. And they need not even be people from your sample. It can be your friends in your lab, or it can be other PhD students, or it will be your family members. So in this case, I do something like a card sorting, where I take all the survey items, and what I do is that once you have the survey items right, I write each survey item on a piece of paper or on a card. Okay, and I tell people, and let's say I get the 2 of you, and there were 4 of you to begin with. Let's say I give all those questions, a bunch of questions. There were 60 questions or 50 questions in total. So I give you 50 questions to each of you, to the 4 of you, and I ask you to place those questions on different categories, questions that you think belong together and questions you think don't belong together. And that you can do, right? And if you think they belong together, you put them in different piles. If you think they don't belong together, you put them in separate piles. And for each pile, I'll ask you to give that pile a name, whatever name you think that pile should have. And if that name matches the name that I have, let's say I'm trying to measure happiness, then it's a good test of, am I really measuring what I think I'm measuring? That's a very, very important part of coming up with quantitative measures. Are you really measuring what you think you're measuring? Okay. So that is the part of test. In this case, this is one of the studies this is another study that I have here in terms of source quality and all that. And this is from my PhD work. So here I have all these questions that I have for these. So this is called unstructured sorting, where I take 4 graduate students who are not informed of the research model and who are invited to sort all the items into an unrestricted number of categories. And they were also asked to name each category for the item. And they were all given an envelope, and they could take all the items and you put them into different categories. Okay? And I asked, this is what I'd give. I asked them, put these in categories and also come up with a label and a definition for that. And how many items did you have in each pile? And based on these, in this particular example, I had 11 constructs, so 11 things I was trying to measure. And I tried to see the hit rate. To what extent were people able to get this right? And if some item the hit rate was really low, 41% or something, then I know that the survey questions that I have are not good enough because they are not hitting what I'm trying to measure. Okay, so then I come up with 86%. So that's my first exercise. In the second exercise, I get four other students or 4 other people in the lab, and this time I give them the names that I'm trying to measure. I give them the names of categories, and this time it's slightly easier because I've given you names, and I ask you to put the items into those different names. Okay. So then, so yeah, these were some of the. Oh yeah. So one thing that I do, once I see the problems, right? Whenever I find that some items, like this item is put into 2 categories, when it should belong to only one. Like all the things for use should be only in use, but there was one item which was put somewhere else in some other category. And this was for quality, again, one item which was put in some other category. And for this one, there were a lot of problems. Like 5 items were put in the items belonging to some other category. So then, whichever ones are problematic, we need to go and reword those to make them distinct from each other after that in your survey. So items before serving, it would be very difficult to get to something. It would be very hard to get to that. I need to consider so many factors to do this task. The task requires me to consider so many factors. So even simple wording changes, right, can fix problems in a survey after you identify that those are the problems because of which they were clubbing together. So once you correct those things, then you again take all those items again, put separate piles, and give it to form 4 other people now. And once you give that, this time my hit rate was better. It was 90.66 earlier. Than before that, my hit rate was like 86 point something. Yeah, some of the problems got solved. And if you want, at this stage, you could even repeat this exercise again to get to a very high hit rate of 97, 96% or something. So, and this is really good because you're not really using, you're not paying people to fill out the survey in this case. Do you see that? You're not paying $20 to each person. You're not collecting 30 responses, 50 responses. You're just using people in your lab or people at home or your friends to do it. And by doing that, your survey gets like much stronger at this stage. And you know that all the items that you're trying to measure are different from each other, that they're supposed to be different. So they satisfy the criteria of convergent validity, which means items which belong to one construct are sufficiently converging towards that construct. And discriminant validity means these items are different from the items which are that you're trying to measure in another construct. So coming back to the simple example that you had earlier, right, Chris, that you came up with, where you had imposition of library fines and library usage. These 2 items, this is supposed to be, if you come up with 5 survey items of how do you imposition of library fines and 5 items of library usage, these are sufficiently different from each other because fines are to do with money and library usage is a very different thing. But if you had things like patron satisfaction and patron happiness and some other things, those were going into the muddled areas of trying to maybe measure the same kind of things. Okay, so once you have this, once you're satisfied with this procedure, okay, then you could do a pilot test. So once you do a pilot test on this, then going back to this paper again, okay, so once you do a pilot test, you can do an exercise which is called a factor reduction. Okay, let me show you another paper. Yeah, I just feel that's why there's so much to cover in this and we have so little time. So this is what you do. You put all the data in it, and once you throw this data in SPSS, I was actually even going to show you, demonstrate in SPSS, but we don't have that much time today. But okay, so once you throw all this in SPSS, any value which is greater than 0.5, okay, so I had 11 things that I was trying to measure, and SPSS gave me 11 categories or 11 columns in my data, okay, and each data, whichever value is greater than 0.5, I mark them in bold, all the values which are greater than 0.5, okay. Once I mark them in bold, I find that I have some very, very neat categories in my data. Where is this? Wait.
Do you find that SPSS is generally the best software to use? Do you ever use R?
I'm not familiar with R, so I cannot compare. I know that a lot of people are using R now, so maybe R is better in some cases, might be. But because I was trained in SPSS, so that was what I ended up using and that I'm familiar with. But I need to try out R. So this is again, whichever questions are self-developed, you write those. Whichever questions you came up with from other places, you need to cite those sources. Okay. And so instrument developed. So whenever available, the measurement items for this study were adopted from prior literature. Else new items were developed. And questions use a 7-point Likert scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So we first validated the construct validity. So I showed you how the construct validity was validated. Okay. So verification. Oh, sorry, I think this is scrolling too fast. I'm not able to control the scrolling.
We're not seeing anything. We're just seeing the.
Oh, you're not seeing this?
We're only seeing the table of the PDF.
Oh, it's the sharing is a big issue here. Okay, sharing, and I'll stop in the next 4 minutes. Okay, I know that this is getting too long, so I know we will not get time to cover everything, but okay. This was the paper that I was showing you. You saw that? Are you seeing this PDF?
It's black right now.
It's black. Okay, share screen.
I wonder if you have a permissions issue. Like if you need to have every single app be approved.
Yeah, I'm approving this one right now. Now, do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are my survey items that I had. Okay. I had these 11 items, and these were the questions that they. And for these, I just want to show you the way to write. Yeah, this part is important, I think. And after that, this will be a good ending to our. So the first part is coming up with, again, a literature review of each variable, and then coming up with the hypothesis the way we saw in the other paper. Okay. And then main data collection. Okay. Is jumping from across pages. Oh, single page. Oh, now I know. Single page continuous. Okay, now that's good. Yeah. Okay, now this is good. Yeah, construct validity. So verification of construct validity followed 3 steps. First, experienced researchers in the field were consulted to discuss the wording of each item. The instrument was revised based on the feedback collected. So second, we adopted a 2-stage item sorting procedure recommended by Moore and Benbasat. So in the first stage, 4 judges, graduate students who were not informed of the research model and constructs, were invited to sort all items into an unrestricted number of categories. They were also asked to name each category. The 4 judges correctly placed 87% of the items into the rightful construct piles. They were interviewed to reveal how they understood each item. Ambiguous items were altered. On the suggestion of judges, 5 items, importance 4 and comfort 6, CMM 1, CMM 3, and use 1 were added after the first round of sorting. So in the second round of structured sorting, another 4 judges were given the names of constructs. They were asked to determine which construct each item best conformed to. This time, all judges placed 91% of the items in the correct piles. For items that were placed in the wrong categories, further changes were made to remove ambiguity. 1 item was added. Finally, a pretest was conducted to fine-tune the instrument, whereby the survey was administered on 12 graduate students. They were asked to comment on the understanding of each item before filling out the survey. Minor revisions were made based on the feedback. So you see how much of pre-work needs to go into verifying the survey items, making the instrument is really solid before you send it out to people. So after you finish this stage, this is where you are supposed to send it to IRB. Once you are satisfied from your end, that is the stage after you've done all this pre-testing and everything. That is when it goes to IRB. Once it comes back from IRB, then you do a pilot study. So then we do a pilot study on a sample of 110 people to verify and finalize the survey instrument. So this was done on a working population, and each person is paid $10 for the participation. Okay. So now what you do is that once you get this pilot data, right, then to validate the conversion and discriminant validity of the instrument, Psychometric analysis was performed as per the procedure recommended by Anderson and Gerbing in 1988. So exploratory factor analysis with Varimax rotation was performed on the pilot data using SPSS 16. The rotated component matrix for the pilot data set corresponded to the source type online info as listed in table 2. So even though this sounds scary, it's not. It just basically means whatever data you have gotten from the survey items, you clean the data, you throw the data in SPSS, you click on something called data factor reduction and 2-3 buttons, and SPSS will give out the things to you. So you don't really need to understand a whole lot of statistics in order to do data analysis. You just need to work with a researcher or professor to ask which buttons do I need to click. Okay, and once those buttons click, then you know what are the problems that you see. Okay, so once you click those buttons, then you see that I got a table like this. Now we need to know how to analyze this table. So according to that procedure that was recommended by those researchers, you're supposed to look at every row, and in every row you're supposed to mark those values which are greater than 0.5. So when I marked that, if I found, let's say row 10 had these 5 things which are greater than 0.5 and row 5 also had those things which are greater than 0.5, then that's a problem, because that means my construct 5 and construct 10 are correlating. They're not different from each other. So if I find that, that means I might have to drop that from my model altogether, drop all the questions from question 5, because I find that 5 and 10 are very close to each other. Let's say your happiness and satisfaction. So I might have to drop out satisfaction questions from my model altogether, because those questions are too similar to each other. In my case, what I find is that I have a very neat row, and when I take all these first 5, right, I see that they very nicely belong to the first items of task importance. And for this second set of 5 questions, again, they very nicely belong to the 5 items of CMP5. So I have 11 constructs and 11 kind of categories or components thrown by SPSS. So which means that I can say that my survey, my instrument is valid, or it is reliable, that it is able to give me, like, you know, and this one shows these are certain things again that you need to indicate when you're trying to put this table. Eigenvalue, these are again given to you by SPSS, so you just need to report it. Okay, and you can find various examples of studies done by other people as to see how they've reported the data. So you can just follow those examples. So typically what happens in a statistical study is that you do one study once, and you can repeat that for the next 20 years because you do everything in a similar way. You just have different things that you're trying to study, but the reporting and all of that is pretty similar. And you keep following the same procedure, and you keep reporting in different ways. So across my various survey studies that I've done, you find that my earlier study that I did on 3G adoption, that is a good model to follow. There might be minor differences on things that I did overall later on, and in reporting and things, because some data might be different, so you might require to do some test which is different at different times. So that's all, I think. So based on this procedure, then you carry out the test, and then you do different kinds of analysis. Over here I had one link that I'd put. Do you see my browser right now? You don't see my browser.
We still see the PDF.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. So this is kind of painful. Like, I don't have the option to share the entire screen. And Google Chrome. Okay, I'm sharing my browser now. Okay. And this browser, I'm showing a link as to choosing the right statistical test or the types of examples. Okay. So this is not very difficult. What it is that you don't need to understand the details of every test. You just need to know, based on your data, what is the right test to use. And if you don't know that, you can always consult another researcher or another professor as to what is the right way to do it. So when you have data, right? So basically, there are certain assumptions that if the observation is independent, if there's called homogeneity of variance, if the data follows a normal curve, all that. If those things are there, then you could do something called a parametric test. You could do there. If your data doesn't follow these basic assumptions, then you have to carry out a more complex test called a non-parametric test. Okay? And there are various types of variables that you learn about. One is called continuous or discrete variables. Any variables with like ratio and all that, 0.75 numbers, all those are continuous or discrete. Ordinals are things to do with rankings, like rank from 1 to 5 or something. Binaries, again, yes, no kind of questions. nominals are brand or species. So these kind of variables are called categorical variables. So in your example, right, when you had you had imposition of library fines, okay? So is the imposition of library fine a yes no question, or is it an amount question? That's one thing you have to see.
I took actual data. I don't know why I mentioned it earlier because you were talking about surveys, but I took data from our software and I got a dollar amount, but then I also broke it into categories. I termed that. So I used it as a continuous variable and as categorical variable, because I broke it into either no fines or fines under $25, because you can still use your library card if you have fines under $25. And then a third variable of over $25, because that would make someone not be able to use their card, and therefore, of course, they can't use their, of course, they'll have less usage.
So you see that. So if it's a fine versus no fine, that would be a binary variable, a categorical variable, right? But if you have the exact dollar amount or the number of cents and all that, that would become a continuous variable. So depending on the type of variables that you're trying to measure, that would determine what kind of method you use as well. So when you're choosing a parametric test, when your data satisfies basic assumptions, you have sufficient number of sample, let's say 200-300 people that you've gathered data from and all that, there's sufficient power, then you can do like this is where the thing comes in. Between a predictor is your independent variable and outcome is a dependent variable. Okay, so if you have one predictor and one outcome, if both are continuous, okay, so then you could do a simple linear regression. And or if you have, let's say, if you have two or more predictors, two or more independent variables, like we had in the 3G option study, right? In the 3G option, we had 3 independent variables, and you have one dependent variable. Then you could do a multiple linear regression. So again, this means SPSS will have a button of how to go, and you have click data analysis and regression, and then you click those buttons once you know that this is the kind of test you need to do. Okay, and if there are others for it, so if you have predictor and outcome, if it's a comparison test, then you could do categorical one predictor, and then you could have like outcome is quantitative. Okay, and then so this is where you could use either a paired t-test or independent t-test and so on, if it's a comparison between groups and so on. If it's two groups, then typically you use a t-test. If it's two or more groups, then you use like ANOVA, MANOVA. Okay, and then these are other examples of non-parametric tests if a data doesn't follow those certain assumptions. And there's a flowchart as well as to see like, okay, is your independent variable categorical or quantitative? Categorical or continuous? If it's categorical, then you do certain things. Okay, if it's continuous, then is the outcome variable again categorical or quantitative? If it is quantitative, if it is one variable, you do simple regression. If it's multiple variables, you do multiple regression. If your independent variable is categorical, and is the outcome variable categorical or quantitative? If it is outcome is also categorical, then you choose a non-parametric test. If your outcome is quantitative, then do a comparison of means test. If how many groups are you comparing? If it's two groups, then you do a t-test. If it's more than two groups, then again you see how many outcome variables. If there's one outcome variable, then you do a ANOVA. If there's more than one outcome variable, you do a MANOVA. Okay, so let me come back to my slide now again. Do you see my slides? No, you don't see my slide. Okay, I'll share my screen and then PowerPoint and then share. Okay, so
I wonder if there's something in whoever set up the Zoom, if they may have like checked an option that doesn't allow someone to share their screen.
Okay, yeah, I think
I've never had this happen before.
Yeah, I'll check that out. I think this is a new laptop that was assigned to me, so I think they need to see.
Oh, I just tried sharing screen while you weren't, and I also didn't have the option that I always have of sharing my whole screen.
Oh, you didn't have the option. Okay.
So it's got to be something.
There could be something. Yeah.
Whoever set up the Zoom.
Okay. So we looked at this example of a context-based study. I showed you an example. The 11 variables were from this study, and we also saw this study on. Sorry, let me go back to this. So yeah, so I showed you this study, right? The verifying survey items, and I showed you this study which had all that the statistical analysis of separating those exploratory factor analysis of those, separating into those 7 items, 7 categories. And then there are other survey studies I've done. I didn't really, like those are all in my website that I showed initially on my research page. Library adoption, knowledge management using Web 2.0, knowledge retention and transfer. And this is another one. This is done in 2016. This is a study using both qualitative and quantitative methods. It has examples of coming up with instruments for both. And this is a recent study, again based on a survey study. Okay, and for experiments as well, I had designed an experiment, and if there was time, we could go through that at another time. So I think that was all. I think there was a lot I tried to cover, but this is a big topic, and you could go on and on in this.
Thank you. Yes, it's a big topic, but definitely absorbed some of what you put down.
Thank you. Any questions that you have for me? I know we stretched for too long. I think it's almost like 1 hour 45 minutes right now. Yeah.
No, that was interesting. I've never done I've done survey methodology before, but never putting things into categories like that. I kind of did a more almost more mixed methods approach, but it's given me good ideas of how to work with data.
Yeah, so you see how everything has to be very thought through, like your research model, your variables, the way you come up with hypotheses, how the literature review and the theories need to lead to those, lead to that approach of coming up with models, then how the items of that need to be separate from each other and sufficiently belong to each other, how that affects your data. So everything is very close-knit when you design a study well. So it's very hard actually designing a survey study and doing it well. There's a lot of work, but
yeah, mine are feeling very loosey-goosey compared to that.
Right. No, I think a lot of times I feel that we don't really train our students enough in a lot of ways, but it's a process. I think the more you work on it, the better you get. And it's also that doesn't come easy. It's a lot of training required, and I'm still learning. I think the more years you spend, you keep learning because you keep finding out more ways to do things. Okay, so I just hope that you got some appreciation of quantitative study design, and it's a little bit about the analysis process, even though we didn't really go into SPSS and all of that, but I thought going there without understanding why you're doing what you're doing would be like too premature.
Yeah, and they'll cover all that in our required statistics class anyway.
Yes, you'll cover that, yeah. Okay, so thank you for staying until now, and let me know if you have any further questions. And Chris, I think we'll set up a time to talk.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.